Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, from the preface, paragraphs 4 and 5. Culture and its laborious emergence from the immediacy of substantial life must always begin by getting acquainted with general principles and points of view, so as, at first, to work up to a general conception of the real issue, as well as learning to support and refute the general conception with reasons. Then to apprehend the rich and concrete abundance of life by differential classification, and finally to give accurate instruction and pass judgment upon it. From its very beginning, culture must leave room for the earnestness of life in its concrete richness. This leads the way to an experience of the real issue. And even when the real issue has been penetrated to its depths by serious speculative effort, this kind of knowing and judging will still retain its appropriate place in ordinary conversation. The true shape in which truth exists can only be the scientific system of such truth. To help bring philosophy closer to the form of science, to the goal where it can lay aside the title love of knowing and be actual knowing. That is what I have set myself to do. The inner necessity that knowing should be science lies in its nature, and only the systematic exposition of philosophy itself provides it. But the external necessity, so far as it is grasped in a general way, setting aside accidental matters of person and motivation, is the same as the inner. Or, in other words, it lies in the shape in which time sets forth the sequential existence of its moments. To show that now is the time for philosophy to be raised to the status of a science would therefore be the only true justification of any effort that has this aim. For to do so would demonstrate the necessity of the aim, would indeed, at the same time, be the accomplishing of it. So, once again, we have this term, the real issue, die Sache selbst, which is very much the focus of his thought here. And he acknowledges that this is not something that really presents itself right away, that there has to be a good deal of sort of propedeutic or heuristic preparation before the real issue can really be talked about in any kind of a meaningful way. And I think what he's talking about here when he talks about the need to form from general principles a general conception of the real issue, a conception which in turn is going to be critiqued to apprehend the rich and as well as learning to support and refute the general conception with reasons. I think what he's proposing here is basically something like a catechism. The idea is that in order for philosophy to get started, it's got to have some kind of a framework, some kind of a pre-given understanding or conceptual system that may end up needing a great deal of revision. In fact, we might find out that the entire system needs to be thrown out, but thought can't really get underway if it doesn't sort of have that at its disposal, a kind of a compass of concepts, you might say. And I would compare this to something like, the catechism that you go through in Catholic Church. There's this kind of synoptic compendium of the basic doctrines of the church that everybody has to learn. And most people, of course, most believers, most churchgoers really never get beyond that. They don't really, they never get to the point where they're actually reading, Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine. The catechism is enough for them, that basic little compendium of doctrine. What I think Hegel is saying is that we have to have that. We have to have the catechism, even if we end up throwing it out, because thought really can't get underway without some kind of a conceptual framework. Even a false one will do, in a sense, if the thinker is sufficiently self-critical, if he submits that framework itself to critical scrutiny. Um, this would be the way of putting us in a position where we get to have what he calls an experience of the real issue. He says culture must leave room for the earnestness of life in its concrete richness. This leads the way to an experience of the real issue. And oddly enough, the figure that comes to mind for me here is Kierkegaard. He's the one that sort of most aggressively criticizes Hegel for sort of lacking in his system that earnestness of life, for trying to develop a system in which, the disagreement and the preferring of one option over another becomes sort of unsophisticated, naive, and the old habit of choosing the either or, we kind of lay that aside in favor of something that can sort of embrace all opinions at once as moments of an historical process of reasoning. Kierkegaard believes that in trying to include everything like that, Hegel is not really making room for the earnestness of life. The fact is that in the course of human existence, things summon us to take a stand, and we are called upon not simply to entertain both options as essential moments in the self-development of thought, but rather to choose one over the other, to pick a side and struggle against an enemy. Hegel, in some ways, seems to suggest that there is nevertheless room for that within his system. That beyond all of the kind of academic reasoning and jockeying of historic doctrines and so forth, there is also an experience of die Sache selbst, of the heart of the matter, the thing that calls us to sincere commitment. But that's something that only comes into view after very, very rigorous and lengthy study that has to begin with a more or less arbitrary catechism of basic concepts. He then goes on, after explaining that, to give us an incredibly ambitious sense of his total project here. He claims that he really wants to turn philosophy into a true science, to display it as a rigorous science. I think in the same way that Husserl later would talk about philosophy als strenge Wissenschaft, philosophy as a rigorous science. And he invokes the sort of etymology of the word philosophy. His goal is to lay aside the title love of knowing and be actual knowing. Philosophy, of course, philosophia. It originally meant a love of wisdom or a love of knowledge. Philos is the form of love that corresponds to brotherhood or friendship. Interestingly, that it is philosophia and not erosophia. Eros would be sort of romantic or sexual love. It's not that kind of love. Instead, we have a kind of side-by-side relationship of the philosopher with wisdom. The philosopher wants to be close to wisdom, but he does not really want to identify his thoughts with wisdom as such. His aim is to constantly approach wisdom, but never presume that he's attained it. That's sort of the classical, I would say, a kind of Kantian orientation toward philosophy, where the emphasis is laid on not going too far, finitude, moderation, don't say more than you can know. Hegel has the ambition to know everything. He thinks that philosophy should count as true and certain knowledge. It should reach beyond merely the affection for wisdom or the brotherhood or the friendship with wisdom and attain to true, actual knowing. And the way that he claims this goes about, there's a kind of a two-phase process. There is both an inner necessity and an external necessity to this. And the inner necessity that he talks about here, the inner necessity that knowing should be science, lies in its nature, and only the systematic exposition of philosophy itself provides it. I think what he's saying here is that if we could imagine a total perfect philosophic system, having been formulated, then merely to be exposed to it would already be sort of sufficient evidence for its certainty. Its internal coherence already shows its truth. And in a sense, its truth is indifferent to whether